what's your long-term vision for the future of food, and how are you creating that with your work?
You looking at
Go
me,
ahead,
Isha?
Paul.
All right. Well, first and foremost, I just want to give a shout out to New Harvest, and they brought us all together here. Please give them a round of applause. They're doing awesome work. Really, really fantastic work. I'm very honored to be here, Isha, so thanks for inviting me. I can't believe I got Mark Post in my audience. That is insane. I should be in Mark's audience. So, to answer your question, though, directly, I guess I would think of it like this. There's a lot of us here, myself included, who have been devoting our lives to trying to create a more humane society, a society where animals are not just viewed as commodities. And it's clearly not possible to create that type of a world while we are farming and slaughtering billions upon billions of them. And so if you look at, for example, what happened in the 1800s, where whaling was the backbone of much of the American coastal economy, it lit the world. Everyone in their home had whale oil lit lamps. And there were all types of concerns about extinction. There were concerns about the treatment of whales. And yet, in 1853, this Canadian geologist named Abraham Gesner patents kerosene and commercializes it. And within 2 decades, the American whaling fleet had been decimated by over 80%. People switched to something that was more affordable and superior, to kerosene. And so what if the things that you all were doing could make a slaughterhouse appear as antiquated as a whaling boat, or could make a factory farm look as quaint as a horse-drawn carriage in the way that cars did, as we heard earlier, for horses who suffered in our streets for so long. So when I look at that vision, that's what I'm hopeful for, is that the technology that so many of you in this room are engaging in and are executing will actually help lead us toward a more humane society where we don't rely on animals in such a dominating and exploitative way.
Thanks, Paul. And Dana?
Thank you. I'd like to echo the, I'm very humbled and grateful to be here with everybody. Been really blown away by some really amazing conversations and how much we actually all have in common and the values that we bring and how much we're on the same team in terms of our concern for the environment, for animal welfare, and for pushing forward a vision of a sustainable future. So thank you. At Friends of the Earth, we are working towards a more just and sustainable food system, one which is based on principles of agroecology, one which is local sustainable agriculture, which is going to be beneficial for people and the planet, and that is not just based on environmental principles, but on animal welfare, that's going to be healthy and sustainable for farmers, for people across the world, as we know that 70% of people get their nutrition from small sustainable agriculture, and that's going to be sustainable for the long run. And my work is in biotechnology and the applications to agriculture, and to ensure that what we're pushing forward is in fact going to bring more benefit than harm, and to make sure that what we're doing is actually going to work for the long run, and that's based in the precautionary approach. And really I want to sit in that space of tension as we're moving forward with innovations. What does it look like to really sit in a place of discomfort so we can deal with the tensions between conservation, food, nature, and biotechnology, and try to avoid any unintended collisions. So I'm excited to sit in that dialogue as we work together.
Thanks, Dana. And David?
Thanks, Isha. Yeah, so at Soylent, we're interested in creating healthy, convenient, and affordable foods that are simultaneously providing all the benefits to our consumers and elevating health across the world, while simultaneously taking advantage of sustainable and efficient forms of food production. And so specifically, from our perspective, what we try to do is gradually replace ingredients in the formula for our various food products with ingredients that have been produced via sustainable and efficient and scientific production methods. For instance, the algal fat that takes place as a component of the dietary fats in our ready-to-drink product. In addition to that, what we hope to accomplish is we feel that to some extent consumer perception has lagged behind the scientific consensus with regard to GMOs and whether or not they're healthy or an important part of the future of our food system. And so to the extent that we can get consumers comfortable with that concept as well, that's a way that we feel like we can contribute.
Thanks, David. Nicki?
Yeah, thanks, Isha. I think for me, I'm really hungry for a larger paradigm shift when we talk about food. Where right now, I think the value proposition around food is quality over cost, and quality is so loosely defined. I want to bring in also impact and food values as well, so we can talk about things like sustainability and health and access and responsibility and trust, right? And really make good food available to more people.
That was a great answer. How do you think cellular agriculture and biotechnology plays into the visions that you outlined already?
Well, just to go back to the whaling example.
Yes.
So I just finished a book, this huge tome on the history of the whaling industry. That's why I'm even thinking about this. But in April of 1861, Vanity Fair had a great cartoon. I'm sure you all read the issue. So it was a ball of whales who were all dressed up in tuxedos toasting each other, and they were toasting to the invention of kerosene. And they really had been liberated by this invention. And if you think about that, and you think about what may come to pass now, I mean, right now Americans are eating more meat on a per person basis than any other nation on earth, in effect. Meat consumption in the US is going down, but globally it's going up. Mm-hmm. And there's no way to really achieve the goals that we're seeking, either from a planetary sustainability perspective or an animal welfare perspective, as long as meat consumption is going up. And the only way to satiate that demand for meat, if people want to eat it, is through these technologies, whether they be plant-based innovations or cultured innovations, and we should be relying on both. We shouldn't be just focusing on one or the other, and maybe there's something else that nobody's doing yet. But we have to think about what type of technologies can actually move us forward, because there are technologies that can be used in a negative way. Obviously, you look at the cotton gin as an example. Good for planters, really bad for slaves. But on the other hand, you can have technologies like cultured meat, which can really go a long way toward helping achieve the sustainability and animal welfare goals that all of us want to achieve.
But kerosene was not a biotechnology. Are there any biotechnologies that you work with in creating a humane economy?
Yes, there are a number of them. So I would take as just two quick examples. So the first, let's say, would be right now in the egg industry, they only use female chickens, obviously, because they lay eggs. So all the males are basically ground alive on the first day of their life. The standard practice in every industrialized country is to take the male chicks, or take all the eggs, incubate them, take the males, throw them into grinders. It's a lot of animals to get ground up. It's a lot of waste because you're incubating all these eggs unnecessarily. And so there's a new technology, a few of them actually, that could basically help sex the birds in ovo, determine the sex of the chick long before they'd ever hatch, so you can divert those eggs. You don't have to incubate them. You prevent the animal welfare problems that are obvious and gruesome. But you also help the egg industry basically because 50% of the eggs are male and then another 15% are unfertilized. So 65% of these eggs in incubators aren't even needed. So if you take those, you can divert them into the egg market, and therefore you need fewer laying hens in existence because you have all those eggs that are now going into the market. So in ovo sexing would be one example. Another would be polled cattle. Right now, most beef and dairy cows have their horns cut out of their craniums. Very difficult for us to imagine what it's like because we don't have horns, but it's not like a fingernail. This is part of their cranium. We cut them out. It's excruciating, virtually always done without painkiller. And we have the ability now to create polled cattle. There's no real difference in these cattle aside from the fact that they don't grow horns, another big animal welfare benefit.
And I'm sorry to ask so many questions, but are those...
It's your job as moderator, actually.
But so many questions to you.
I love it.
Are those biotech innovations things that consumers are weary of in the same way they are about GMO technologies?
I've never thought that that would be the case. I've never heard anybody expressing anything other than enthusiasm. I could be wrong. I'm often wrong, as many of my friends tell me here, especially some of the people in the audience. But I've never heard anybody expressing concern about it. But maybe they do. But I think most of us, at least in the animal welfare and sustainability communities, look at those as great uses of technology that will make the world a better place.
Cool, thanks. Dana, how should we be approaching biotechnology according to your vision?
So I think we need to approach it with a lot of caution. We have a lot of problems in the environment, problems with animal welfare. Friends of the Earth works closely with the Humane Society on reducing meat consumption and how do we have a system of animals, raising them sustainably that is better for people, planet, and animals. However, a number of concerns are really important to address if we truly want a sustainable future for food. And there are different approaches. Some people in this room are using one approach. At Friends of the Earth, we are looking at what is the entire life cycle of these different technologies? What is the impact of feedstock? Is that going to perpetuate and exacerbate industrial, heavy, chemical-intense, water-intense agriculture for feedstock instead of for growing food, which we know we need to feed the majority of the population? We want to look at the concerns around how these are regulated. These are a lot of new technologies which don't fit into the technologies that we have, which are 30 years old. How does this play into questions of corporate consolidation? What are the questions around transparency? I have a different membership constituency, perhaps, that are very concerned about these technologies. Over the past 30 years, there have been a lot of promises with genetic engineering, which haven't played out after a lot of promises. You know, we have a lot of herbicide-resilient crops, but there are a lot of things that didn't come to fruition. There's a lot of distrust, and these are all questions which I've just listed that we need to look carefully at and be honest about them. Consumers more and more want to know what the entire life cycle of their agriculture, their animals, their food is, and how can we answer those honestly with data as opposed to speaking purely hypothetically.
You mentioned distrust. Where does the distrust come from?
I think that a lot of the distrust is both historical and current. Historically speaking, as I mentioned, we've heard a lot of false promises around genetic engineering, solving world hunger, reducing dependency on water, using less pesticides, a lot of things that haven't come to fruition. With the GMO salmon that was just approved, there was a promise that this was going to grow faster, it was going to be more nutritious, it's going to feed lots of people across the world. Now, granted, they're not in stores yet, but we have independent research saying, oops, they're not actually going to grow faster, and actually the amino acid and the fatty acids aren't going to be present. There are a lot of goals and a lot of really important intentions, but we need to not get ahead of ourselves. Just recently, just last week, the Senate passed a GMO labeling bill, which is now in the House today, and will go on to the president. There's a lot of distrust that came out of that, not based necessarily on whether foods should be labeled, but on the large corporate, big ag influence on our regulations. And an industry definition of biotechnology and bioengineering, which actually cuts out the majority of genetically engineered foods. So there's a lot of trust that needs to be restored, and that's going to happen with data, and that's going to happen with transparency, and that's going to really happen with all of us sitting in dialogue together around the tensions between true sustainability and accessibility, and answering, you know, who is this sustainable for? Is this sustainable for plants, animals, small farmers, or is this sustainable for one particular company that wants to buy cheaper products?
Yes. For David, I actually wanted to put a slide up. So speaking of transparency and trust, Soylent put up this slide, or sorry, not a slide, a big billboard that has a very clear message. David, what was Soylent's intentions with this, and how does it contribute to transparency, if it does, or does it not say enough? Is it a license plate?
We did this because we felt like a lot of the food industry was running in this direction that we felt was a little bit backwards in some respects, that of course, just by the virtue of time, as of today, we are the most advanced that we have ever been. And so we have supercomputers in our pockets, yet somehow we're running to shovel leaves into our mouths. And we feel that there's a way to utilize technology in the food system and make that more efficient, both in terms of production of food and in terms of allowing people to consume their nutrients on the individual level more efficiently. And so what we truly believe is a lot of the sort of badges in the food industry currently, like non-GMO, natural, organic, to name a few, are simply emergent properties of consumer distrust over the food system, because historically many large food companies have either deliberately or by accident pulled the wool over the consumer's eyes. And so by taking a firm stance and saying that really what we believe consumers want is a food that has everything that they want and nothing that they don't. Something that has all the nutrients that they need, that's free of contamination. And so the production method, as long as the end result is exactly what the consumer wants, provided it's within these environmental constraints and moral constraints, et cetera, that really people ought to get on board with the scientific and efficient food production. And currently, genetically modified foods are a very important part of that.
When you go to that link, soylent.com/GMO, it says that Soylent wants to label all of its GMO ingredients, but it hasn't been so far. So how are you going to do that?
Sure. So one of the things that we've actually already introduced on the latest iteration of our packaging, which is going to be available in a matter of weeks, is getting ahead of the government regulations with regard to labeling GMO foodstuffs. And so we're already displaying on our packaging on this next iteration that we contain genetically modified ingredients. And as you can tell from the billboards, it's not something that we've shied away from. I think our only sort of concern or regret, as it were, is that it seems like the GMO labeling process in some part is being utilized by a non-GMO sort of fear-mongering crowd, which seeks to use this as an advertising claim when in fact, it's essentially baseless.
Well, there's non-GMO and there's pro-GMO. Are you saying with this billboard that all GMOs are created equal?
I think that, any time that you say all or none, you put yourself in a very tough spot. So I think, by virtue of saying we're pro-GMO, I think, what we're trying to accomplish is indicate our stance on the spectrum and foster some conversation that hopefully will be useful for all parties.
Thanks. And Nicki, you've done a lot of work with consumer acceptance and marketing and brand communications. As an expert in that area, do you think consumers will accept foods made with cellular agriculture? And if so, why or why not?
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's familiar with the public health industry knows that when you tell a consumer they can't have something, that doesn't go very well. So to me, that's the promise of cellular agriculture, right? It's giving consumers the meat and the dairy and the eggs that they love without having to give up those kinds of foods, right? So it's offering another option for incremental change where I think asking the mainstream consumer to go vegan is probably not going to happen, at least for the foreseeable future. So can we have more sustainable ways where people can have those foods that aren't going to have, the damaging effects on the earth or health?
Paul? Isha?
Plant-based, vegan is usually lumped in with non-GMO, gluten-free, no trans fats, ethical sourcing, et cetera, et cetera. Why do you think that is, and do you think that makes sense?
I appreciate the softball question because no, of course it doesn't make sense. I was so offended that we had gluten in our sandwich for lunch today. I couldn't believe that. No, I mean, look, I am a vegan. I've been a vegan for 23 years. I think it's a very good thing to do. At the same time, most of the people who I know who share that don't fall into those categories. Admittedly, some do, but I think it's a stereotype that is basically used to try to marginalize that type of a person. And so overall, what I would love to see is, just like Dana was talking about, people eating less meat. I agree. I think it's unlikely that people are going to en masse become vegans. At the same time, I do think people will eat less meat. I really think that there will be a movement afoot to going toward a plant-based diet, especially because of the plant-based innovations that are happening now from Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods and so many of these other companies. But I think, I mean, I'm very proud to say I'm one of the few dozen humans who's actually eaten cultured beef. Thank you, Andras. And when I tell my fellow vegans that I ate it, they often, I'm thinking, what are they going to say? Like, oh, like he's not even a vegan, whatever. But most of the time, they're like, oh, cool, how was it? And I say, oh, it was awesome. It was great. I hope that more people get to eat it at some point soon. And so, no, I don't think that's a good lumping of groups together for any reason.
I know one of the comments earlier was that, I think was it Sarah who said, my vegetarian friends aren't interested in cultured meat. Does that matter?
No, frankly, it doesn't. I mean, I don't care whether vegans and vegetarians eat this. They're not the market. The market is meat eaters, which is more than 9 out of 10 people on the planet, including here in America. And so if people who choose not to eat meat choose not to eat cultured meat, great, no big deal. But we're trying to reach the people who are going to KFC, reach the people who are going to McDonald's. And I don't believe that they're going to have any of those type of concerns. I think that they're going to eat it. And there's a big discussion about what to call it. You call it cultured meat, clean meat, meat 2.0, whatever. I hope they just call it meat. That's what it is. It's anatomically identical. And so I hope that there won't be any labeling of it, that it will just be out there and you'll go to KFC and order your chicken nuggets and they're going to come from Paul from North Carolina State's lab, and they're going to be great.
Do you have something to say, Nicki?
Yeah, I think just to support what Paul's saying, there's absolutely a flexitarian movement afoot where in 2015, 7.5% of new food products had vegan claims on them, right? And that doesn't seem like a lot, but that's up from 2% just 5 years ago. And that growth isn't being fueled by vegans. It's being fueled by meat eaters who are trying to cut back, right? So I think there are smoke signals that people are looking for other options. They just need them, right? And food has to taste good, right? So calling it meat, making sure that people understand that it tastes just like meat is going to be critical for cellular agriculture to get off the ground.
Since I'm supposed to be a non-opinionated moderator, but I do have an opinion, so I'm going to put it out there. I actually think that cultured meat should be designated as cultured because the benefits come from the fact that it's cultured. And it's also an opportunity to educate consumers and get them involved in the process of culturing meat, even at this early stage. Do you think that, how about Dana? What do you think about that in terms of transparency at this stage of the game?
I think if this industry is going to go anywhere, we need radical transparency. And I know that this is going to butt up against a lot of international intellectual property rights and proprietary information. But quite honestly, the movement that we've seen, and I offer this as an observation, is that consumers want increased transparency. They want to know the entire life cycle. They actually want to know the process. They're not going to make a distinction between is the final product genetically modified or is the entire process genetically modified. To the average consumer, it's genetic modification. There are questions that they want answered. They want to know what kind of feedstock, is that sustainable? They want to know about the farmers. They want to know about the health questions. And they want to know that this is regulated. People want to see labels. They want to see what they're eating. People want the right to choose what they are feeding their families. And they want to have terms substantiated. When you say sustainable, how do you back that up? The term natural, I would argue, is almost useless now because of the range of abuse that label has experienced. So I would actually argue that for full acceptance, call something what it is. If it's genetically engineered in the process, call it genetically engineered ingredients. Call it derived from a genetically engineered experience. But to be honest, I mean, what we're hearing And what we're observing is that increasingly people want truly sustainable, plant-based, animal-based products that have been truly responsibly raised. And they want to know that their food has been part of a solution, getting to the root causes. And there is so much distrust of the techno fix that consumers are going to go for what they feel is actually part of a larger solution. So I would disagree politely so and agree.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that we should call it meat. I think transparency is critical. Whatever we call it, I think consumers need to know how it's made and where it's coming from.
I'm in complete agreement with you, Dana, that natural is completely useless. And I mean, just to give an example, the chicken that is sold today comes from animals who have been genetically manipulated to grow so big, so fast, they can barely even walk more than a few steps before crippling underneath their unbuckling weight. They may not be GMO, but they may as well be. I mean, these are animals who are bred to suffer. I mean, they're not in cages, but they're prisoners in their own bodies. And so, most people right now are buying meat from animals who are pumped full of hormones, pumped full of antibiotics, led horrible lives, were horrible for the environment, and they're just buying it. That's the majority of meat. That's what consumers are actually buying today. And so I don't think that those consumers are going to have those types of concerns. At the same time, I'm all for the transparency. I'm a big advocate for it. I'm writing a book on the topic right now to help explain this for lay people, not that, which I am one, I'm not like some technical expert, but to explain what all this is, because these companies are like, you know, as Andras was saying, he wants Modern Meadow to be producing leather very soon, like 2 or 3 years on the market. You talk to the folks at Memphis Meats and others, they're talking about 4 or 5 years with possibly, and I think, you know, perhaps others. By the way, you ever notice they're all M's, Mosa Meats, Memphis Meats, Modern Meadow? You gotta get more creative. But anyway, so I'm all for the transparency on this in terms of helping people understand it. The company's making the process very transparent on their websites and so on. And we'll see what it ends up getting called when it actually is commercialized, but I do hope that it is recognized as the identical product that it is, except for superior in many ways.
Speaking of that kind of different GMO technology, I know that Friends of the Earth has referred to cellular agriculture, cultured contained products as GMO 2.0. What is the difference between 2.0 and 1.0?
Sure. So, sorry, it's loud. We refer to GMO 1.0 as what we have had on the market, transgenics. If you think of where genetic engineering has come, there used to be 2 different ways to do genetic engineering, right, with a bacterium or a gene gun. I wish that I had a slide, but there's now more than 30 different ways, if not more, to do genetic engineering. A huge list. And the difference is vast. The level of intervention at the cellular level, the precision, the speed, the cost, all of these are different, and they're different enough. They're all genetic engineering, but they're different enough that there are new risks and concerns that are raised. We know that, you know, just rearranging, even if it's just 1 or 2 base pairs, that might be the difference in a human of cancer or not. The consequences may be unique to these new techniques, and we need to have regulations, and we need to have robust assessments of the environmental, the health, and the socioeconomic impacts before these new technologies enter the environment or the market.
Is 1.0 and 2.0 enough of a designation?
No, within GMOs 2.0, and this is a term that we use often to speak about consumer products, this is leaving out the applications that we've heard about being applied to conservation or de-extinction or you know, using gene drives perhaps to cause an animal or an insect to go extinct. There's a lot of applications. We could talk about GMO humans, we can talk about the pharmaceutical applications. So, and the techniques within genetic engineering are incredibly vast. And I don't believe that we can lump them together. There was mention earlier on regulations referring to grass, generally regarded as safe. This is a 30-year-old regulation that is based on your own self-audit. It's a voluntary process. You talk to the EPA, FDA, and the USDA, and they're the first to admit that we don't have regulations to deal with this. We don't know how to assess these new technologies and have oversight and monitoring. And so that we can ensure that we stay on the same page so that the values and so that the visions that we all have to create a better world, to really benefit the environment is actually what happens. We really need to not get ahead of ourselves. People want transparency, they want real food, they want clean labels, they want to know that something is truly sustainable based in data, and we need to really act with precaution and not move out ahead of regulation, assessment, and oversight, and really knowing that if we're going to call something sustainable, can we justify that? Can we look at the feedstock? Can we look at the risks of contamination? And can we say with confidence that we know how to address the unintended consequences, which will inevitably happen?
Are there unintended consequences from not developing these products?
Right now, I would argue that there's a lot of data demonstrating less risky and more vetted scientific methods and technologies to address a lot of the concerns that we have right now. I don't think that we should stop researching. I don't think that we should stop this dialogue. However, I think it's important that we are looking at what solutions are the least risky, which are the ones that are most sustainable, which are the ones which are most responsible. Really, we want to see more science. We're not at all anti-science. In fact, we're very pro-science, but we want to see more of it.
David? Soylent is a little bit, did you have something to say?
I was going to just respond in an undirected manner, but if you have a
Please
specific
go
question,
ahead.
I'm happy to do
No,
that.
please go ahead.
I was just going to say I totally agree. I think, I think it's just about striking the right balance between regulation and gathering safety data and pushing forward. You can think of examples like one of the reasons why Genentech rose to prominence, for instance, is because it took advantage of a moratorium on research by the city of Cambridge, such that Biogen, this more established biotech company, wasn't able to dabble in recombinant DNA technology. And when you think about the two main sort of outcomes of that, human growth hormone and insulin, and you think about sort of the people suffering from diseases that required supplementation of those chemicals, it drives, I think, a direct parallel in the food system and food research in that, we have people who are starving today, and through the more efficient allocation of resources and using the latest scientific technologies, we have an ability to stem some of that bleeding immediately. And so, of course, the extreme of that is rushing into the field and delivering untested sort of scientific products, and nobody is in favor of that. I think it's just, we want to make sure that the burden of proof for safety is reasonable and allows solutions to be delivered in a timely manner.
So Soylent is very well defined on the nutrition end. Is it defined on the life cycle assessment side of things as well?
In terms of our food, in terms of all the ingredients in our product, most of them are fairly industry standard food ingredients. I think, as we're continuing to sub out ingredients that are using biotechnology, for instance, our algal fats, the life cycle is less understood, but I think that, one of the sort of interesting heuristics that you can use to gauge that is if you think about the efficiency of the system and how we need to compete with other foodstuffs at a certain sustainable price point and maintain a margin in order to stay in business. We have to be able to buy ingredients at a certain price point, and so the efficiency is often baked into the model itself. And again, as you continue to push forward, the efficiencies and the economies of scale continue to increase, continue to drive down cost, and continue to make the production of these ingredients more efficient.
I'm going to actually, this screen of questions is very exciting. So I'm going to actually ask one to Nicki. Nicki, are we in a bubble? would the average consumer care about the issues that we're talking about today?
I think they have no idea about what we're talking about, the average mainstream consumer. I mean, I think even if you look at research on GMOs around consumer perception, it's hugely negative, but most consumers don't even know what a GMO is. There's just a lot of skepticism and fear around it. Well, thanks. But I do think the people that know the most about it and understand it are, I mean, what you would expect, right? People with higher education, higher incomes, right? And so there's not a lot of like education at the mainstream level about these things, no.
Yeah, I agree with Nicki, and it brings to mind a somewhat recent study that was done of American consumers, reported in the Washington Post and elsewhere, showing that 80% of Americans want foods containing DNA to be labeled. And I know all of us in this room think it's very funny, but then they also wanted mandatory disclosure on any food saying that foods with DNA can be shown to be passed from mother to offspring. And so there's a general unfamiliarity with this. I got to give a shout out to my man Arturo for enlightening me about this study from Clara Foods. But let's just keep it real. I mean, most people eat meat without thinking about where it comes from. Yes, there's an undercurrent of people who are looking for things like, sustainable, local, grass-fed, but that's probably less than 1% of the market of meat in our country. And so even if you quintuple that, you're still talking about nearly all of the meat coming from factory farms that are employing conditions that any reasonable person would find, to put it very mildly, atrocious. And so I think that, are we in a bubble? Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the things that my friend Bruce Friedrich from Good Food Institute points out often is that the three things that people tend to buy food on are price, taste, and convenience. And all other issues come in a distant fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, et cetera. It's price, taste, and convenience. That's what people are looking for.
Mira, I want you to put up a slide of the tomato cans, please. So this was the very first GMO that was introduced in Europe. It was a tomato paste, and alongside the packaging, which said made with genetically engineered tomatoes right on the front, and that was a decision made on the part of the people producing the tomatoes and the grocery stores. They also had pamphlets and leaflets describing what genetic engineering was and how much data they had to collect in order to get regulatory approval. And this came out in 1996. This was like the first GM food in Europe. And it actually outsold tomato paste from non-genetically engineered tomatoes for 3 years. And then in 1999, it was taken off shelves because of the general vibe about genetically engineered products. Who wants to take the first step reflecting on this story and seeing what, did we learn something? Did we learn that we should actually trust consumers with information instead of thinking of us as being in a bubble?
Well, I would argue that the story is a little bit more complicated.
Of course.
And I would argue that there were a number of products that were trying to come out onto the market that had unintended toxins. There was the Flavor Saver tomato that was having problems, having unintended toxins in their product. I also don't think that you can separate out a GMO tomato paste from the larger industry, and that's something that I think is really important for consumers, conscious consumers, who may not understand how transgenics actually works, or who might not understand how directed evolution works, or a gene drive, or what have you. However, people do understand the larger industry and that it's much more complex. We're starting to understand the problems with the herbicide-tolerant crops. People were starting to understand problems with Roundup, and it does get lumped together. Likewise, that's going to be a problem with some of the techniques and technologies that folks in this room are using. You can't separate out. While I think that together we have a lot of really good values and motives and intentions, this is part of a much larger platform. Synthetic biology, new plant breeding techniques, different forms of biotechnology is much, much larger, and not everybody in the industry has the same motives and intentions that folks in this room might have. There's a lot of applications that are solely profit-driven. There are a lot of applications that will result in and the loss of livelihoods of farmers that will have a lot of negative unintended consequences that are going to bleed in across the entire industry, whether or not that's what you're doing. And it's important to know what is the context of the industry that I am in. And I think that that is what happened with the product. It wasn't about that particular product, but some of the concerns that were starting to come to light about the technology writ large.
And I mean, I think just on this pointing to tomato can example, I'd want to know how many people actually took those leaflets, right? Because if we're just trusting people to look and read a packaging label, that's usually not happening, right? The average supermarket has over 10,000 different products, right? They're not going to be scanning for genetically modified ingredients and saying, I feel safe with that, I'll take it, right? So.
I'm going to take one of these questions from this list. Nicki and Paul, because you're non-scientists, what can non-scientists do to advocate and promote cellular agriculture in an effective way? Actually, I guess we're all non-scientists.
We sound like a band.
Yes.
I mean, I would say, like, speaking in terms of some of the companies in this room as we think about, like, the core pillars of communication in terms of speaking about cellular agriculture, I think there's a few things. I think one is transparency, and I won't say radical transparency. I think that we need to be very open about what we're making, how we're communicating, and making sure that information's available. But I think using Paul's example about 80% of consumers not wanting DNA in their food, some people just don't understand these things, and they want to know what's happening, but they're not going to get the full picture, but at least having that information available. I think the second thing is really positioning, and what we're talking about in terms of cultured foods and cultured meat products, it's different than what Spybex is doing, right? Because this is food and this is something that you're putting in your body. And people buy food for taste, right? That's the number one reason why people are buying food, taste and price. And so we need to really think about taste and make sure that we're painting a picture about this being a delicious product and something that's sacred and very emotionally tied to us. And it's not a science experiment. So I think we need to take cultured meat out of the lab in terms of communicating it. And then I think the other thing is options, right? I don't think that we can position whatever product is coming out of cellular agriculture as the perfect solution or the only option. I think it's one thing to reduce strain on a really overworked system.
Dana, Friends of the Earth lists in their achievements as keeping GMO seafood off store shelves, opposing the GMO apple, and campaigning to reject cell-cultured vanilla, which is made with GMO 2.0 yeast. Is there an application of genetic engineering that does or does not exist today that you think would advance Friends of the Earth's goals?
It's very possible. And I think we're very open to it. Again, we're for the responsible use of biotechnology, the responsible use of technology. With all of the different foods that we have come out in opposition to, it's for the same reasons. We want to see independent scientific assessments that are robust enough to address the problems which have been raised with each one of them. We want to see assessments not just around the environmental impacts, but also the health, and in the case of the symbiovanillin, the socioeconomic impacts. We want to see solutions that are truly sustainable, and with each one of these, we felt that there are truly sustainable solutions that are already being pushed forward, that if we want to invest in a sustainable future with seafood, then let's invest in the sustainable harvesting of seafood, and marine biologists, and there are different organizations and companies that are saying, actually, there is enough salmon in the sea to be shared. How do you harvest them? How do you fish sustainably? With the GMO apple, it's a cosmetic thing. There is no nutritional value there. So there are many different reasons, but we want to see regulations with the RNAi, in the apple. We want to see regulations, assessments,
who should be conducting those assessments?
I think that when applying for market approval, you need to have scientific assessments that don't just come from the company. We wouldn't ask, the IRS doesn't allow a company to do its own self-financial audits. And there's been a lot of examples when companies do their own scientific assessments about the risks, there's a lot that can be left out. And we've seen that with numerous different herbicide-tolerant crops. And so I think that having an assessment outside of the company, which stands to make the profit, is really important for consumers to build trust and to be reassured.
Paul, you work with lots of farms that have to be assessed for how humane they are. Can you reflect on some of the things we're talking about when it comes to who assesses what and who should be assessing what?
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with Dana that self-auditing, while it has a place, is of course, it doesn't replace the concept of third-party auditing, which is very, very important. All at the same time, I just want to hit on that issue about what non-scientists can do, because it was such a popular question. You got a lot of likes on that thing. So if you're a non-scientist like I am, and in fact like our whole band up here is, then I think there's a lot of things that you can do, but if you look at the success of a company like Hampton Creek, whose co-founder Josh Balk is in the audience, but if you look at Hampton Creek, what they've done is made their product not just the same as mayo in that particular case, but really it's better than mayo, it's sexier than mayo. When you look at it, they have that brand. And people who want to help promote the acceptance and normalization of cultured meat, eggs, and dairy in our society can help to do the same. You look at, for example, the really wonderful video that Memphis Meats put out about their cultured meatball, and that thing got millions and millions of views, really a great video, and by sharing that online, you can help spread the word about this, how amazing and promising this is. Super Meat, just this week, a brand new Israeli startup doing cultured chicken, very exciting stuff. They just put out a video, I think 2 days ago, about the promise that they have, and they may not be that far along in their process, but I'll tell you, their video is really awesome, and I think it's a good idea to share it. Maybe more money on the production side rather than the video production side, but either way, it was a cool video, and it helps tout the benefits of cultured meat. So I think that by sharing those types of videos and other maybe interviews with the scientists, doing this to show like these are people who are largely motivated by a desire to make the world a better place. I was with Mark Post in the Netherlands about 10 days ago, and he was telling me like his whole goal is to try to basically save the planet. Like that's his #1 goal with this. This isn't like DuPont and Monsanto just trying to make a lot of money. He's not in it to make money. He's in it because without something like this, whether it's this or something else that's truly transformational for our food system, we're not going to have much to save anymore. And that, when I meet these people who are doing this, the pioneers who are in this space doing it, almost universally they have this desire to use this as a way to help transform the world for the better. And I think getting that message out, that the motivation of the people behind this is so noble, will be very helpful for the acceptance of cultured meat when it does get commercialized.
Who is to say that the people at DuPont and Monsanto also don't think that they're making the world a better place?
I wouldn't suspect one way or the other about them. I just know that those are companies that have a connotation associated with their brand among many who would suspect that. So I'm not making any real commentary one way or the other about them. In fact, if they want to get into this space, more power to them. But I'm just more making a comment on the people who are doing this. When you get to know them and realize what their backgrounds are and why they're doing this, I think to that, there's a saying that people don't know how much, or people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Well, these people care a lot, and they've identified what may be the most pressing problem on the face of our planet, and they are trying their hardest to use their specialty and expertise to do something about it for the benefit of us all.
Thank you. I think we're all trying to make a better planet here. Okay, a couple more questions? Actually, I have a question for David. So Soylent is kind of different from a lot of the conversations about food right now, because I think a lot of conversations are focused on increasing diversity, whereas Soylent, I think, seems to be about decreasing it. Is that true or false, or what do you want to say about that?
Diversity in what sense?
In the sense of the types of foods that we have access to. I mean, a lot of our conversation about cellular agriculture today is about not only creating the products that we're familiar with, but also going further and creating products that we haven't even seen yet using these fermentation processes. And I know that Soylent is using an algal oil that is brand new, which is a new thing, but as a product itself, it doesn't quite increase the diversity of the foods that we eat.
Yeah, I guess my response to that would be that we are trying to think about food production, both food production in terms of food products for consumers, as well as food production of base ingredients as platform technologies. And so when you think about trying to find different monomers or different food ingredients that you can mix in different orders, the possibilities in terms of the food products that one could produce are quite complex in terms of one startup company trying to find the shortest path from A to B. For us, it makes sense to have a smaller product portfolio and focus more on the proliferation and messaging behind a simpler product suite. However, that's something that we do hope to change in the future.
Nicki, what do you see as best practices in communicating sustainable food technology? What kind of words are meaning? We said earlier that natural was a useless word. I think we probably all agree on that. Which words are not useless?
I mean, however you feel about the word natural, and I agree it's a useless word, it did spark a dialogue, right? And I think it did make consumers think a little bit more about what's in their food at the highest level. I think the exact words that we use to communicate cellular agriculture, it's a bit of a question mark right now. It's such a nascent field, right? There's so far to go until we actually have products to put words on and nutrition labels on. But I think the things that I talked about a little bit earlier around transparency and just overall positioning of the product as a food, and trying to meet consumers across, I think, a range of different motivations, right? So I think we'd all like to think that people care about the planet and want to eat for sustainability, but that's not the case with the majority of consumers right now. They're eating for different reasons. So whatever those motivations might be, whether it is sustainability, whether it's health, which health is actually the primary driver of why people are starting to take on a vegan diet, or whether it's having something that your child will actually eat at the breakfast table. I think really thinking about that spectrum of motivations and trying to communicate against it.
Thanks, Nicki. So I'm going to wrap up this panel with a question with one word answer each.
Yes.
So what, okay, I need to come up with a good question. What is the most important thing that we need for communicating food science?
Enthusiasm.
Nice.
Transparency.
You stole all of our words.
Boldness.
Nice.
Memes. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
I would say honesty.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a really wonderful discussion.